Hello and welcome to this Amuse Bouche for Year 8 on Othello. So, in their study of Othello, Year 8 are about to understand the wider world of not just the Shakespearean context of race, of gender, of generational divide, but equally to think about how that's echoed in today's society as well. So in terms of expanding the worlds of our students, it's enabling our students to look at a context that seems so distant from them, but equally to appreciate how a lot of these key themes that Shakespeare's discussing are quite prevalent in today's society as well. As ever, our spiral curriculum moves backwards and forwards, and Year 8 is no different. So, prior to Year 8, students have looked at the Shakespearean drama of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and they should be coming into Year 8 with the vocabulary to be able to describe Shakespearean drama so they understand now that they need to refer to the audience as opposed to referring to the reader. It's a playwright and not a writer. But even more than that, they'll understand what stagecraft means and they'll understand exits and why that's significant and why it's significant when the characters are left alone on stage and basically the conventions of that particular genre. In their study of Shakespearean drama in Year 8, some of the key concepts that they're coming into is obviously relationships. They'll fall back upon their understanding from Year 7, but equally they're beginning to think about tension and they're beginning to think about discrimination and prejudice, which is something that's related to in an Oliver Twist in Term 2A when they think about the importance of social class, of poverty, and that in itself refers later in their modern fiction text Blood Brothers, where they think about the division of the classes within the two twin brothers and how that's being presented on stage. So actually there are lots of opportunities for students to uncover these wider concepts that are initially introduced within Year 8 and then really explored as their year progresses. So if you're new to this scheme, a really good place to start is to look at the phase content and to begin to think about how it differs from the Year 7 content and from the Year 9 content as well. So we'll look at all three strands. We'll start off with contextual knowledge. In Year 7, it was very much about understanding Shakespeare's world and understanding sort of Jacobean and Elizabethan changing attitudes really towards gender and marriage and generational tension. In Year 8, they're taking that knowledge, but there's more of an emphasis upon understanding this play through the lens of a tragedy and the conventions of that and things that are prototypical to that piece of drama. But equally, again, drawing upon their earlier work on key concepts such as, for instance, dominance, choice, imbalance within society. And then when they move into Year 9, they begin to think about tragedy in a more developed way and they're thinking about the kind of elements of that in the 5-part structure, but equally they're beginning to think about the impact of things like the divine right of kings and the impact of that on wider society. So they're beginning to develop that really secure sort of AO3 comment when they come into Year 11. And then terminology and technical knowledge. We talked about this earlier in the Year 7 Amuse Bouche for Midsummer Night's Dream, but we would expect Year 7 and Year 8 to be able to be quite competent in all those bullet points. So in Year 8, there's a real opportunity now just to focus on the more complex aspects of the writer's craft, such as pathetic fallacy, symbolism, and the development of semantic fields, juxtaposition, foreshadowing, a cliffhanger. Again, these skills are really interchangeable. And when you're thinking about the ability class that you're teaching, maybe just double check that they're really secure on identifying the difference between noun, verbs, adjectives, adverbs before we start thinking about pathetic fallacy and symbolism. So it's just a way of sort of giving yourself a temperature check about where the students are in your class and what gaps you might need to fill before you go forward. Within the scheme overview, you'll also find the theme vocabulary for this scheme, and you'll see that depending upon the key concepts that you find within the text itself will be where the majority of the words land. So for instance, power and control is a really key concept within Othello, so you can see there's a majority there of those words linked to that key concept. It's not a checklist. They're there as a way of identifying keywords that students will need to be able to articulate when they're discussing this particular concept. You'll find them on the curriculum learning slides and they need to be referenced throughout the text and throughout the lesson. Just a brief explanation of the scheme overview. So you'll have these for each of the weeks that you're teaching the scheme. I've selected week 2. And when you look at it at first, you've got the conceptual question. So how is power and dominance conveyed in relationships? That's the question that students are thinking about during the course of their learning for that week. And just kind of referring back to that theme vocabulary, it's making sure students have got the vocabulary to which I discussed that key concept and returning to it routinely and using strategies like word webbing, for instance, as a way of really embedding that vocabulary so they feel quite confident in using it when they come to their independent practice. Underneath, you've got the content coverage, so you know that for week 2, they're just focusing on Act 1, Scene 3. And then to the side of that, you've also got the learning question and the coverage. So for each of those key questions, there's a sort of note on the coverage that students will be doing as a way of answering that question for that lesson. And then again, going back to the phase content, you've got the aspects of technical and analytical knowledge that students will require during the lesson, the contextual knowledge they'll find, and equally the TT vocabulary that may need explaining to students as you progress through the scheme for that week. So when completing tasks or reading through extracts and annotating, students will use their booklet. And that booklet has been designed in a way that means that students should see what's ever on that PowerPoint slide reflected in the booklet themselves. So it should help to speed up note taking and avoid dreaded glues going missing. A couple of things to note for the Othello scheme that's slightly different from the Year 7 is that at the beginning of an act, or at the beginning of the extract, students are given a brief sort of kind of context of what was being referred to. That's very similar to Year 7. But what you'll find at the very beginning of the booklet itself is that students are given almost a route map. So you can see here that they're looking at the characters of Othello and Iago, and they've been asked to kind of look after their learning at what they've written down and kind of reflect upon the words, the key quotations they would use for that key character within Act 1. And it's almost like a kind of summative task, really. So it could be that during that week you looked at Act 1, for instance, and then at the end of the week you can ask students to go back to the booklets and think, right, what's your key quotation for that character? Defend it. And what keywords would you use to describe Othello in Act 1? And as the learning progresses, what you'll find is that students can kind of track the journey of that character across the different acts and almost kind of track the demise of Othello and the strengthening of Iago as the play progresses. You'll also notice that's very similar to the Year 7 scheme, is that you've got the emojis that denote all the characters, and there's almost like an index of them at the beginning of the booklet so that students understand who we're referring to. There's a bit of a blurb that explains who they are and why they're significant in the text. You'll also notice that within the booklet, because we're also handling either fiction or non-fiction text to support their understanding of the concept we're discussing within that week, that's been placed where it appears in the scheme rather than being at the back of the booklet. So it's not that students will be given a separate booklet for these extracts, they just appear where it appears in the scheme. At the bottom of the extracts, you'll notice that you've been given a key quotation. Those key quotations are normally donated in like red ink when you're reading through the extract itself. So you know it's a key quotation students need to look at the end of that reading. Also linked to the extract is that you've got a little box there that students can make notes, but that's not to say that students can't annotate the actual body of the text as well. Both are applicable. It just gives you an opportunity to kind of find out how they want to kind of develop their note taking in lessons. So we're just going to look at two slides, one from the main scheme and the other from the nurture scheme. So here's one taken from the main scheme. It's just a really quick, sharp sort of extract reading lesson. So students are reading through the extract, they've been given some prompts, finding the yellow boxes, and they would annotate in their booklets. So you've got what image is created with this word fetch, what does it suggest about the views of the women at this time, and as much as possible it reflects what the page outline looks like in their booklets so students can see how the two are linked together. In the nurture scheme, students are still being asked to use the same extract. That hasn't changed, and the same outcome needs to be arrived, but the level of support is given to students. So for instance, you'll find that perhaps the instructions within the text box have been changed slightly. So why might Desdemona feel divided? So then really focusing upon the idea of divided and that being linked to the icon, the division sign. So you can see here that we're trying to support the students through dual coding, but equally we're thinking about how we could express that question so it targets the area that we want to focus on. So if we're looking at divided duty, rather than saying the phrase divided duty, just focus upon the word divided and really understand what that means and why she might feel divided itself in order to really access and understand that character at this point in the text. That's the end of this Amuse Bouche for Year 8 Othello. If you have any questions or queries, please speak to Ellen director and they'll be happy to support you.